Good evening, everyone. It's David Linco. I'm presenting the webinar this evening, and we're talking about retirement planning, particularly suited to property investors. So over the next 45 minutes, I'll be helping you answer three key questions. When can I start my retirement? How much can I spend in retirement? And will there be enough at the end? And all of the issues in between, because as a property investor, it's never that easy to answer those questions, as difficult as they are. Now, to make sure you are interacting with me, there's a dashboard in front of you. So if you have a comment so that you like, just raise your hand. If you have a question, just pop it in the chat box, and feel free to provide questions along the way. I'd like to make it as interactive as possible. So that way, if you like a point, just give me a thumbs up or raise your hand, and that'll be like giving me a high five. Okay, so let's get going. A little bit about me. So, as I said, my name's David Linco. I run a business called Davlin Wealth Management. I've been working with the Property Club for, since 2003. And my background is as an accountant. That's what I was when I initially graduated. In 2003, became a mortgage broker. And then 2007, became a financial planner. And over the last 10 years, doing a lot of work helping people with retirement planning, particularly with the Property Club, and the challenges of how to structure a portfolio in readiness for retirement. It's very different to a very simplistic approach to retirement where you just have superannuation. So that's a little bit about me. The information I'll be sharing with you this evening is general only. So I'll be covering off principles more than information. It'll be principles. I mean, you can Google Centrelink information. You can Google about what happens to loans in retirement. But I'll be focusing on principles which are timeless, and I've been using these three principles ever since I started retirement planning. That was pre-GFC. So let's have a bit of fun this evening. Now, when it comes to retirement planning, there's a lot of concerns. I'm not going to go through all of these, but the key ones I find are: will I run out of money? Give me a thumbs up if that's a question that you would ask when it comes to retirement. Will I run out of money? Number of hands going up. Yep. And it's what was identified in the Retirement Income Review report that was commissioned by the federal government. Running out of money meant that people had too much money in retirement. And the problem with that was, often when you realize you've got too much money in retirement, you're in the second to last phase of retirement, where you're living more of a sedentary life. And you can't do all of the activities that you intended to when you first started retirement. So running out of money is a key one. The other one is, when can I stop work? Because it's not only having enough for retirement, it's a case of what do I need to do before I stop work in readiness for retirement. The other big one is, how much can I spend in retirement? That's a big one as well. So a lot of questions. Retirement is a significant change in life stage, not only in finances, but mentally. I won't cover the mental and emotional changes they go through. Well, firstly, I'm not a psychologist, but I've observed and talked to psychologists to help people understand the changes that they go through when they move into retirement. So dealing with the finances is enough, but then managing your emotional and your mental transition are significant. So it's important to be aware that I'm only covering a small slice of that. So let's get warmed up by starting with a poll. And over the course of the next 45 minutes, I've been going to introduce you to some people who have already retired. This is Corrie and Sue from Queensland, client since 2009, retired in 2016, portfolio of IPs. One of their goals was to have a great holiday each year. So this is them at Victoria Falls. That divides Zambia and Zimbabwe, so nearly 2 kilometers wide. Looks like they're right on the edge, but trick photography. So let's get an idea of who's here this evening. And I'm going to ask you, what's your key asset or your primary asset in retirement. It's only one or the other. And that way I'll let you know what everyone else is thinking. I'll share it, and that way you'll get an idea of who am I with the crowd in this webinar this evening. I've got another poll a bit later on. I won't spend too long, maybe 30 seconds. It'll just give you a sense of who's here. So let's close that now. I need to think about these polls. They're pretty easy. And let me share that information. So look, no surprise, this is a property club event, and you'll see nearly 80% of people have property as a key asset in retirement. So whenever we look at asset types, it's not good or bad. It's a case of understanding how an asset works in wealth accumulation versus retirement. Okay, so it's very important to understand that difference. Okay, so I realize everyone's a property investor. That's fantastic. Let's now look at well, that's one of the toys that Corey had. So nothing wrong with getting a couple of toys in retirement as well. Okay, let's look at the wealth versus retirement mindset. And this is Mike and Jane, and I believe I saw Jane and Mike online this evening. So hi guys, hope you're well. Lovely picture of you guys. I hope the motorhome is going well. So this is Mike and Jane. And they retired last year, and I wanted to talk to you about the wealth versus retirement mindset. So this is a key challenge for many people when they approach retirement. Imagine you've been working for 40 years. For many people, maybe 50 for a bit longer. You're in the mindset of accumulating wealth. So when you move into retirement, which we call wealth drawdown, it's very challenging to change your mindset. So let me go through a couple of principles that I went through with Mike and Jane, but also with every person I do retirement planning for. So the first one is the accumulation mindset is focusing on assets and cash flow to a lesser degree, but whilst you're working, it doesn't matter because you can afford to carry the shortfall. Cash flow is not as important, but when we move into retirement, the primary focus is cash flow. And that'll become a lot more clearer as we delve deeper into this subject of retirement planning. The next one is negative gearing. When we're building wealth and working, negative gearing is actually a benefit. It helps us save tax. But when we're retiring, then negative gearing can actually be a problem in retirement because firstly, there's no tax benefits and you're just building up the losses. The other point to make when it comes to negative gearing in retirement is that you're accumulating losses, as well as utilizing your liquidity. Liquidity, what's liquidity? Well, it's your super fund or your cash. What that means is when you've got a negatively geared portfolio in retirement, and I know 78% of you this evening are property investors, you're actually holding your property assets if it's negatively geared and utilizing your super a lot quicker. That's all. And once again, remember, things aren't as simple as saying, is it a good or a bad thing? It's about understanding the impact of that. And the impact of that is your liquid monies, which is your super, gets drained a lot quicker. Because bear in mind, you're funding not only the shortfall, but also your living expenses. So it's a challenge to determine how many years you can do that. And often people say to me, well, David, I'd like to hold it for another year or two. And once again, they're in the accumulation mindset. And I'll say, why do you wish to retire? I want to retire. But because they're in the wealth accumulation mindset, they're looking at building assets, not on cash flow. So it's a very good slide, this one here, to focus on your mindset. And Mike and Jane were very similar as well. They'd already been retired for a couple of years, so they were getting used to the mindset. But it's very important to understand, why do I wish to hold my assets for another year, 2, 3, 4? There's nothing wrong with that, but it's important to understand the mindset, to understand why you think the way you think, and also the impact of that as well. Got a question from Peter talking about holding versus selling. Peter, I'll get to that in later slides because I do have a scenario. Jane said, why is cash flow more important than assets in retirement? It's because you need to fund your retirement. And one could argue, well, what about if I create a positively geared portfolio? Absolutely. That's a valid scenario. It comes down to whether that positively geared portfolio is going to give you enough for your living expenses in retirement. But yeah, valid point. So my goal when I do a retirement plan is not to push you in one direction or the other. It's to let you know the options, and then you decide which one you'd like to take and the implications of that course of action. So we're talking about assets, which are accumulation mindset. We're talking about negative gearing, which is accumulation mindset. And so what that means is the focus in accumulation is building wealth over cash flow. That is key. And when it comes to retirement, if you're looking to move yourself towards retirement, it'll mean that you have enough. Having enough then means you change your focus so cash flow is a primary objective over wealth. Because if you reverse it, building wealth over cash flow, essentially you're putting your retirement on hold, or living your best retirement on hold by taking a lesser income in retirement. So do have a think about that, wealth over cash flow and cash flow over wealth. What's your primary objective? And often people won't know, and it'll be triggered by the way they think and the way their comments are when I'm developing the retirement plan. So if you're someone who'd like to keep the portfolio in retirement, there's nothing wrong with that. Remember, it's not good or bad. If that's your strategy, what that means is you're focusing on wealth, and you may have enough wealth and cash flow to do that. But for the majority of people, building wealth means limiting cash flow. So they have to move into the retirement mindset and move to cash flow over wealth. And that may mean reducing the shortfall, managing that somehow to bring it into check. Andrew says, my portfolio is negatively geared to $15,000 per year. Can I hold this in retirement? Well, Andrew, it comes down to what your other assets are, how much superannuation you've got, what your age is, how much living expenses you have, and what your expectations are for retirement. So retirement is quite a complex topic. There's a number of issues involved. So it's not as simple as, can I hold my portfolio? The question can only be addressed if I looked at the full situation of your scenario, looking at all of your financial assets and liabilities. But it's not to say it can't be done. The question is more, what's the impact of holding these assets and holding a portfolio that's negatively geared in retirement? So let's change the way we ask our questions so we can reveal our bias in our accumulation versus retirement mindset and ask, what's the impact of doing this, or what's the impact of doing that? Okay, let's talk about principle 2. So the first principle we talked about was the mindset, retirement mindset versus wealth accumulation mindset. Let's talk about cash flow in retirement. This is a big one for nearly 100% of people that I help. This is the biggest issue, cash flow in retirement. Look, there's an article every other month about cash flow in retirement. This is an article from the middle of 2023. It comes up all the time. Retirees need to work on spending. And it's simply the fear of running out of money. You'll see that there. The fear of running out of money, if asked for a show of hands, would be almost everyone, and including myself, have that. We don't want to run out of money. You've worked for the last 40 years to build assets for retirement. You've worked out, let's say, your retirement plan, or if you haven't, it'll be a case of limiting your spending. And then when you get 10 to 15 years into retirement, people realize they've got too much and they don't spend, but then it's too late. Whereas retirement planning with the right advice means that you can have your cake and eat it too by having your bucket list activities funded for the first 10 to 15 years, and then making sure you've got enough for the next life stage. Now let's talk about cash flow in retirement. How much do you need? Now I've got a couple of handouts. So I've never done a handout before, so let me see if that works. So a good strategy for that is the ASFA living expenses breakdown. So if you Google ASFA living expenses, they'll do a breakdown of your living expenses by category. The handouts didn't work, by the way, so but they're very easily available. So if you Google ASFA living expenses, people say, how much should I spend in retirement? Well, everyone's different. If you're in Sydney, living in the eastern suburbs, you're going to be different to someone living in Mount Barker, for example, in lovely Adelaide, or 20 kilometres southeast, I think, of Adelaide. Michael Brooks, the researcher in South Australia, will be able to tell you about that. So it's very different. So it's good to look at the as for living expenses breakdown as you approach retirement and determine, well, hang on, they say it's this amount for a comfortable and a modest, I'm this much, and then adjust it. The other document that is very useful to understand this topic of spending and retirement is the Retirement Income Review Report 2020. How do you obtain that? It's a fairly chunky document. So just look at the 10 to 15 pages executive summary. So this is good intelligence to build up your financial literacy. How do you get that? Well, you just Google Retirement Income Review Report 2020. And that was a review that the government initiated to find out what's the state of retirement in Australia. And they found out a lot of the problems. So if you're looking to start retirement, and I'll ask you in one of our next polls what life stage you're in, get some financial intelligence and get that information and compare with your current living expenses. Where do I sit? What are the current issues with retirement? Now, I'd like to take a bit more of a meaningful approach to retirement using what I call the health-based approach. So the health-based approach to retirement focuses on 3 life stages. The first one is active, the second one is passive, and the third one is frail. Now, active is simply the first stage of retirement. It means whilst you have your health, you're more active. Could go for 10 years, it could go for 15. Who knows? I hope for you it goes for 20. The question is, you have the ability in active to spend more. You have the capacity, because if you've got enough funding, what we try to do is allocate more in the active stage. And when you then move out of active, and what happens when you move out of active? Well, generally you live a more sedentary life. It could mean that you've got some health problems. It's not to say you need to go into care, but you live more sedentary. You're not as mobile. So when you move into the second life stage, that's what we call passive. How long would that go for? It could be 10 to 15 years. We don't know. You don't know, but it's a guide. So let's say you're retired at 60, 10 to 15 years could take you to 75. Passive could take you to the end of your 80s. After passive, we move into frail. Frail is where you need some level of care. And from a finance perspective, the income requirement for your living expenses is greatest in active. It's less in passive and even less in frail. You might say, well, David, frail, does that not mean there'll be more healthcare costs? And the answer is you're absolutely right. But the whole plan with the retirement as well is to budget for that. And also, if you're eligible for retirement, we should be on your hit list as a property investor. And you might think, if that's something new to you, let's lift the bar a little bit to make sure you do structure your assets to be eligible, because that's the goal that I have when I do retirement planning. But in frail, for many of my clients, probably about 95% of my clients who are property investors are eligible for Centrelink. So they've got access to government benefits and government medical services. So when you take a health-based approach to retirement, it means spending a lot more in active, less in passive, and even less in frail. Now compare that to the standard linear approach to retirement, where it might be 60,000 for the next 30 years or 35 years. I mean, for the first 10 years, you're limiting your spending. You're only doing 60K because you're concerned about running out of money. Then when you get to your mid-70s, you realize, hang on, the asset's too big and you can't spend it because you don't have the health. And then you've got way too much money in passive, let alone frail. The health-based approach to retirement, which is a strategy that I follow, is spending a lot more in active, as well, as long as you've got enough in passive and frail. And there's an approach that we take to ensure that, because when I do retirement planning, I need to make sure that you have enough for passive and frail. And I've got some stories of clients. One is Brent Halbert. Now, Brent is a big believer in active, passive, and frail, so much so that he retired when he was 53. Moved, he was a member of the property club, had, I think it was in excess of 10 properties, couldn't access the super, so he figured out a strategy so he could access enough liquidity for active. Because bear in mind, if he retire at 53, let's say he ceased work. He didn't actually retire because he's very active. He's got a number of hobbies that he does. He's not reliant on labour-based income, but so he's self-funded. So he ceased work at 53, moved from North Ryde, where he used to live in Sydney with his wife Sue, and relocated to Wellington in New Zealand. That's where he was from initially. And they're living the dream. They're living the dream because they've still got their health and they're spending a comfortable amount in active so they can do whatever they wish to do. So think about your approach to retirement. It's not as simple as taking an amount of 60K or 50K or 70K and seeing if that works out enough over the next 30 years. I think that's too simplistic. I like to use a term called living your best retirement. That's certainly not living your best retirement. The other thing with this approach is if you utilize more of your assets during active, you'll be closer to eligibility for Centrelink in passive, let alone frail. So there's an added advantage. There's a method to my madness here. Let's go to principle 3, liquidity in retirement. What do I mean about liquidity? So these may be new principles. So the first one is mindset. The second one is cash flow, particularly the health-based approach. And principle 3 is liquidity in retirement. This is absolutely paramount. And this is also a mindset issue. A lot of people don't think about liquidity. They're thinking about total net asset position. But once you work out you've got enough in your net assets, I call it retirement nest egg. We need to figure out how much of your retirement nest egg is liquid and how much of it is illiquid. Well, let's look at what I mean by liquid versus illiquid assets. So some examples of liquid assets are shares, a painting is a liquid, superannuation is liquid. Some might argue the Mustang is both liquid and illiquid. For the purposes of today, let's call it an illiquid asset. Property portfolio is an illiquid asset. And then we've got cash, which is a liquid asset as well. So when you move into the active phase, the challenge is liquidity. We need a lot of liquidity. And if you take a health-based approach to retirement, you need more in the first phase at 10 to 15 years. So it's important to manage and understand the ratio of liquid assets to illiquid assets. And some of the issues we have in here is, well, it's not going to go away. It's a portfolio shortfall, or you might be already in surplus. A common, and I've got the question here already from Andrew, who says my portfolio is in surplus. Does that mean it's liquid? Well, no, the asset, it's just what you're talking about is the yield or the cash flow associated with the asset. The asset in itself is still illiquid, but I think I understand your question. Now, you're saying the portfolio surplus, is that more appropriate? Well, it is more appropriate, but just because a portfolio is in surplus doesn't mean to say it'll still work to live your best retirement. So if you're wanting to take a simplistic approach or the standard or linear approach to retirement of living on a set amount for the next 30 years, that could work. But I'm here to help you live your best retirement and to spend more in the first 10 to 15 years. And I need you to have more liquidity. So portfolio surplus is a good start, but depends on how much you've got in your liquid assets, your super, your shares, your cash, to see if we can boost it to lift your income for that active period. If it's in shortfall, that's a big issue because you'll be draining your liquidity a lot quicker, and the party will end very quickly because you run out of liquidity. It's important to manage the shortfall, and if you are in surplus, fantastic. It just makes my job a lot easier. But we still haven't answered the question: do you have enough liquidity in retirement? Tighter credit guidelines mean it's difficult to obtain loans. And what that means is for interest-only loans, when they revert to principal and interest, it's extremely difficult to refinance them. It's important to get advice from a club loans broker because they are experienced with multiple property portfolio strategies. Certainly don't go directly to the bank because they're just not aware. It's important to get advice from people who are experienced. And so certainly I'll give you a scenario of how we're able to help someone in this scenario. But interest-only loans reverting to P&I, that'll automatically trigger a shortfall in many cases. What does that mean? Well, it means this retirement strategy has to be reviewed, because you may be neutrally geared, you may have been in surplus, but now you're in shortfall. What does that mean? Well, it's a case of what is the impact of that? Not good or bad, it's what is the impact? Will it mean the dream run will come to an end? Will it mean your best retirement, which I refer to as active, will be shortened? And what happens after that? So these are really good questions to unpack. In a high rate environment as well, it is a difficult holding because the cost of ownership is higher. So does retirement work better or not in a higher rate environment? Well, it comes down to your individual circumstances and looking at your living expenses in active, passive and frail compared to your retirement nest egg and the shortfall. And then ongoing maintenance issues as well. So holding a portfolio in retirement as properties get older, the shortfall will increase. So how does that factor into the retirement plan? So they're not easy questions to answer, but they can be answered, certainly can be answered, and we do that quite a lot. Let's look at super funds now. So you'll be very familiar with some of these names. Industry super funds. Any thoughts on who Australia's largest super fund is? And it's certainly not the Linco self-managed super fund, I wish. But who's got the most money in the super funds? Any guesses? Any thoughts? I've got some for Aware. Someone said Australian super. It is actually Australian super. They are Australia's largest super fund. Now, just understand, just because they're Australia's largest super fund doesn't mean to say they're good or bad. The question is, what does it mean for you? Does it represent value of money for you? Value for money, that is. So let's unpack this in everyday language. How does an industry super fund compare to a retail super fund compared to a self-managed super fund? Okay, so let's look at motor vehicles. And for those of you who are motor vehicle people or rev heads, that's a Toyota Camry, pretty standard vehicle. I think they're pretty close to Australia's top selling vehicle, pretty standard. So this gets you from A to B, has enough features to keep you happy, but it's pretty run of the mill, pretty good value for money as well. That's what an industry super fund is. And with the Camry, there's a couple of options there, but there's not too many variations of that. When you move to a retail super fund, it's not that it's better or not, it's that you've got more options. So now you've got the full spectrum of the Toyota range, from the Yaris through to the Lexus, which is sort of owned by Toyota, I believe. So in terms of value for money, the question needs to be asked of you. Super is the most overlooked asset that I see with clients coming in. If you're like many people, you'll get your super fund statement at the end of the year. You'll have a look at it, think, okay, that looks okay, and it gets filed, and that's the extent of your review. Can I get a show of hands if that's you? Some honest people here this evening. Yeah. And so the question we need to ask is value for money. Fees are one aspect of it only. The other one is returns. The other one is risk. The other one is investment options. So if you're not familiar with superannuation, you do need to look a bit more closely, and you may not be and may not wish to be. That's the role of a financial planner, and that's what I do in preparing people for retirement. Now, if we look at the last one, self-managed super fund, that's the Ferrari. Why? It can do anything you want. And there's valid reasons to have an SMSF, and it does have some downsides as well. And I've got a self-managed super fund, I've got a property in there, and I've got 5 properties outside of the super fund environment as well. So it does have a specific purpose, but it's important to make sure the purpose suits you. So let's explore the self-managed super fund option a little bit more before we look at a scenario. So let's talk about the pros and cons of an SMSF. So can you raise your hand if you do have an SMSF? Okay, not too many people. A couple of people, probably about 5 or 6 people. I know a bit more. I just said there's now 138 people online, so I can't see everyone straight away. So I've got a good number of people, maybe over a dozen anyway. So, and when we're looking at purchasing an SMSF, we need to compare it to purchasing directly. Okay, that way it gives us context. So let's look at a couple of options. Now, the pros of buying through an SMSF. Firstly, it's very low running fees, very low operating fees. There's initially a cost to get one established, but ongoing, it can be cheaper than having an industry, let alone a retail fund. That's the first one. So if you're concerned about fees and you've got over that 200 to 50K mark, often it can be cheaper in SMSF. The other big impact is if you're at the end of your borrowing capacity strategy, meaning you can't buy any more properties in your own name, getting your borrowing capacity assessed for your SMSF, there's no bearing on how many properties you have. So if you'd like to buy another property and you're at the end of your journey, you may be able to buy 3 by setting up an SMSF. So that's where it's key to get your borrowing capacity assessed through your Cobb Loans mortgage broker. And if that's something you'd like to explore, talk to your property mentor. If you're at the end of your journey with your borrowing capacity, it's not over. Have a chat to your property mentor, fill in a financial wealth check form, send it through, and you might be surprised because it's got no bearing on your current loans or your current credit card limits, your family size, etc., etc. So that's a big plus. The other one is it's 80% lend. So you can buy commercial and residential as well. Let's look at some of the cons. Now, there's always a downside. So when you go to one of these seminars, there's a lot of seminars on SMSFs. You've got to understand there's a flip side with anything, even with retirement planning. So it's always important to ask, well, what's the downside to your presenter? Well, the first thing is equity is locked. So if you buy a property in a self-managed super fund, you can't access that equity. And if you own properties in your own name, you'll know that you can refinance, set up a line of credit. We call it harvesting equity within the property club. In SMSF, when the property increases in value and the loan's being reduced, you can't use that as collateral to buy IP2 or IP3. You've got to use the cash that you've built up, which is alongside your self-managed super fund, and use that to go again. The other thing is a high setup cost. There's a high setup cost, and the reason for that is there's 2 companies and 2 trusts, essentially. People come to me and say, David, I can set up an SMSF for a fraction of your cost, but what they're not aware of is the details of that. Often it's not a corporate trustee. It doesn't involve a statement of advice, which is necessary to get the finance. And there's a whole lot of bits of information there as well. So it's really very important to understand the initial setup cost to see whether it warrants based on the loan amount as well. The other big disadvantage is it's highly regulated. Just because it makes common sense, a transaction in your SMSF doesn't mean to say it's compliant. So there's a whole range of tests. And even as a financial planner, you need to be certified in this area of SMSF, which I am, to give advice. So just take care when you're going to a seminar that you are getting good advice and advice from qualified people, because often a lot of presentations occur on the general aspects, but not the specifics. Let's talk about tax benefits. So accumulation versus pension. In accumulation, the SMSF is taxed at 15%. When you go into pension mode, there's no tax. And so when it comes to capital gains, when you're selling a property in your SMSF environment and you moved into pension phase, there's no capital gains tax. And you may think that's fantastic. Yes, but you can't use the equity as long as you're prepared to manage the compliance. And the other, I like that there's no CGT, and I've got a property in my SMSF, and I'll look to cash it in when I retire. But in the meantime, you're only getting 15% tax benefits. Now let's compare that to purchasing directly. So if you're above the 15% tax bracket and you've got power to buy a property or borrowing capacity to buy something in your own name, why would you buy an SMSF? Think about it. So I'm not saying don't, but I'm saying understand the differences. So this is why it's important to fully understand the implications of one versus the other, because it may be better from a tax perspective to buy in your own name first to get more benefits. Yes, at the end there's CGT. There are ways to manage the CGT and then buy one in your SMSF last if you did wish to keep going down the property route. But there's a lot of great tax benefits, but there can be downsides when you look to buy through the SMSF. So once again, if you're at the end of your borrowing capacity route and would like to buy property, have a chat to your property mentor, fill in a financial wealth check and get that done. You might be pleasantly surprised. Now, here's a story from Tony and Gail McQuash. So they only retired last year. He had an SMSF, had 2 properties in his SMSF, and then had some properties outside, and we were able to make their retirement strategy work as well. So I've got quite a lot of clients with many different scenarios. It's highly likely that your scenario is something I've seen before. Okay, let's go to our next poll and find out where are you in your retirement life stage. So imagine you're in a workshop and you're looking around. What's the age bracket here? So are you retired? Are you looking to retire? Or are you quite a bit away from retirement? So let's have a think about that. Actually, you don't have to think, just put one there. If you have to think about it, come on guys, you need to go get a coffee or do something. So, okay, I'm gonna close that poll. Okay, so looking around the room, oh yeah, some of you are looking, a large percentage, that's 70, 80, 83% are looking already retired or looking to retire in the next 5 to 10 years, and a small percentage is 10 years plus. So firstly, a round of applause to those who are less than 10 years from retirement. As I'll show you in the next series of slides, our scenario, the sooner you get the retirement advice, the better the opportunity is for maximizing your financial position and boosting your retirement opportunity. Okay, I think it's always helpful to put this into a model and a scenario that sort of brings it all home. So I've talked about 3 principles. Before I run a scenario, let me tell you what the fees are, because that always comes up and a number of people have asked that question. So there's 2 services that we offer. So as I said, I'm a financial planner certified to help you with SMSF, also licensed with retirement planning. 2 services I offer. So if you're over 50 and like to get what I call a preliminary retirement advice checkup, it's $3,300. If you've got more of a complex set of affairs, it'll be more, but generally that's $3,300. If you're wanting full retirement advice, it's from $6,600. And I say from because it depends on your complexity. Complexity could mean that you're running a business, you've got a trust, you've got an SMSF. So the more complex it is, the higher the cost. And these are done on a fee for service. So there's no obligation for you to continue with me, but they're the services that we offer. Some questions people ask with regard to the PRA service, the preliminary retirement advice. They're wanting to know, am I on track for retirement? So it's strategic advice. It doesn't answer the detailed questions, but people are asked, can I be doing better? So if you're less than 50, that would be certainly something worth considering. Certainly if you're 50 plus, if you don't want to do full retirement modeling. The other one, which a lot of people ask, is, David, should I purchase again? So with this PRA service, I go through your numbers and critique and let you know how you're going for retirement and if you can be doing something more. Essentially, it takes you to what we call optimal. So that's made up of 2 meetings. The retirement modeling advice is an extension of the first service, but it also asks the following 3 questions. When can I retire? How much can I spend in retirement? And will I have enough in the end? So that's why it is more expensive. It's made up of 3 meetings, but at the end of that series of discussions, it's very clear. I aim to answer every question and every scenario. And you'll see by the videos at the end of this document that the service is so comprehensive and so detailed, it gives people peace of mind. Well, I think it's time to look at a scenario. So let's talk about Brian and Susie. Obviously, their names are not Brian and Susie. They're 62. They live in Eltham in Melbourne. That's, I think, the northeast of Melbourne. Brian and Susie are revheads. They love going to Phillip Island and enjoying and watching the car shows. They're only about an hour away from there. So Brian and Susie came to see me. They've done a lot of traveling, so not really looking to do traveling, but more focused on being close to their kids and having family time. And Susie was just about, well, she was working part-time, but Brian was full-time. Wanted to know at 62, could they retire? So this is the approach that I take when it comes to setting up a retirement plan. Firstly, I do a 15-minute call to see if I can actually help them, because it doesn't make sense for me to you to engage me if I can't help you. So did the 15-minute call. I had a chat to them about their numbers, made sure their expectations were something that I could work with. And then they supplied a lot of information. We sent them out an onboarding email, which asked for a lot of information. They gave it to us. We are prepared for it. So over 3 meetings, I was able to deliver the retirement plan. But the first thing I did with them is help them develop the dream. So this was the dream for them. We did some cash flow assumptions first. Remember I talked about active, passive, and frail? In this case, Brian and Susie wanted to be inactive for 12 years. They're in pretty good health, but they said 12 years. Let's start with 12. I go from anywhere 10 to 15, depending on their level of assets. It's no good if you say, David, I want to be active for 20 years if I know your assets are not enough. So in this case, we went for 12 years, and we went with living expenses to 85K. So at the end of active, they were going to be 74, so mid-70s. And then for passive, we reduced the living expenses to 65K. Now that's in today's dollars. Obviously, the time value of money would mean that would be a lot more in the future, and that is taken into account in the modeling. And then in frail, we reduced the living expenses to 50K. These are all in today's dollars. Okay, so 12 years for active, taking them to mid-70s, then taking them to 89 to the end of passive, and then frail. And then once I established the cash flow assumptions, I worked out what they wanted to do. What was their dream in terms of housing? Well, they did want to move into a retirement unit at the end of active. And they also, one of the things they wanted to do was buy a second home in Queensland and become migratory and move to Queensland for the Melbourne winter and live in the IP. So that was what and I asked them for the price because I needed to see if it worked. They said around 500,000. And they wanted to allow in frail for an aged care bond about 600K. Now, aged care bonds differ from area to area. Depends on the land. So an aged care bond, that's what they allowed for. I've got the cash flow, I've got the capital assumptions, and their assets were super and 5 investment properties. So that's what I had to work with. And I also wanted to include some modeling assumptions to keep it real. So I said inflation over the next 30 years, let's assume it's at the long-term rate of 2.7. Capital growth is 4%. Can anyone tell me how quickly properties double in value if they're 4% a year? Anyone? Anyone? A couple of people, 16, no. That's right, Pete, 18 years, thank you, 18 years. 18 years, that's a long, yeah, rule of 72, Pete, you're absolutely right. And think about this last one, gross returns from super 3.6, that's gross. That's before fees, that's pretty conservative. So what I'm trying to do is paint a picture that will almost break it. Okay, and bear in mind, I'm going to increase all the cash flows as we get older. We're downsizing, we're buying a retirement aged care bond. And I'm an aged care advisor as well, so that's another speciality accreditation that I have, which I did mention. So this is getting to be quite complex. Would you not agree? It is, it's not straightforward. The first thing I do once I develop the dream is do what I call the preliminary retirement advice. So this is that first service. If you're not looking to do the full retirement advice, this is what I do. If you're looking to do the full model, I do this first because I need to get you to what I call optimal. So in this case, what I did for Brian and Susie, I did a super consolidation. And not only did I lower the cost, but I improved the returns. Remember, in the retail space, I can get you a lower fund because I can move you into a Yaris, for example, from a Camry. but I can make sure you get better fuel economy and more options. And that's key when it comes to retirement, because your super is a key asset in retirement. So in this case, I was able to lower the cost and improve the returns. And bear in mind, they only had 594K, but their current funds were so bad, and they didn't know. I was able to do an additional increase, not save them fees, but through a combination of fee reduction and better returns of about 31K per year. So that's just on the super, simply because they weren't aware, they didn't have knowledge. So that was the first part of moving these guys to optimal. Then with regard to the asset allocation, bear in mind, a lot of people stay in wealth mindset for easily the first 5 years. I showed them that the risk profile they were in and the investment options they had within the super fund were not suitable. So I managed to reduce the volatility. That's despite improving their super returns. Okay, so it's a case of knowing what you're looking at when you look at a super fund. The other thing is they were overinsured. I identified insurances they didn't know were there, and we made $24,000 a year savings. So that's simply because they weren't looking at their super returns. They weren't looking at the super fees. They weren't looking at the insurances. Brian and Susie had insurances both outside and inside super. That's a hell of a lot of money they saved per year. And the big ticket item was helping them with a mortgage refinance. At 62, they've been dealing with Australia's largest bank and were not able to refinance. The rate had gone up and their P&I was due to expire. So that was a massive saving. Now, this is cash flow saving, so it was quite significant. It wasn't P&I, we moved to interest only. So it's not just the rate reduction, it's moving to interest only. 46K. So we're talking about $101,000 of savings for this client in the preliminary retirement advice service. They did the full retirement modelling, but the little sweetener for this was that as a result of the mortgage refinance, I was able to bring the Centrelink benefit forward by restructuring the loans. So I love doing this sort of scenario because it's a case of just moving the client to optimal before they start retirement, making sure everything is running. Essentially, it's giving your motor vehicle a tune-up and making sure it's performing. Otherwise, you move into retirement with a vehicle that's inefficient and you're just carrying that for the next 30 years and you lose money without knowing it. A couple of questions along the way. Pete said, do you provide fee for service alone or an ongoing service? Well, we do both. So it's a fee for service. So these services are a one-off fee for service. And if you wish to have an ongoing review, you can as well. Alex said, can an existing owned property be moved into an SMSF and is there a tax benefit? The general answer is no. There are exceptions, but I'll say the answer generally is no. Okay, so PRA, that's the first service. If you're not ready to retire, get yourself to optimal. The sooner you do this, the better. Now, there's a whole lot of jumbled, and it is meant to be jumbled because there's just too much detail here. But this is the second and third meeting that I have for retirement modelling. So the first one is that preliminary, getting you to optimal. The next two are where I do the retirement modelling. And this is some serious number crunching, but you can, if you recall, I put all the cash flows for active, passive and frail, put all the liabilities, put the assumptions for capital growth, inflation, eligibility for Centrelink. I also put the downsizing of the home into a retirement unit, buying a second home for 500, allowing for the aged care bond. So I certainly don't have time to go into this in detail, but I want to point out the peace of mind that this brings. You'll notice in green, green is the active periods. Okay, so the modelling commences every July through to June, and blue is the cash flows, and the table 2 is showing the assets you've got left. And the last, the line right at the bottom called retirement nest egg is what your net asset position is, excluding your home. So I've got active going to age 78, and then I've got passive, which is in that sandy or yellow color, going to age, in this case, it's 90, and then frail thereafter as well. So this tells you exactly in that financial year how much Centrelink you'll be eligible for. It'll tell you how much your retirement nest egg is at the end of every life stage. It also allows us to become a little bit more complex and apply some scenarios. So when Brian and Susie determined that it worked, I call it daring to dream in meeting two. Once I tell them it works, they start thinking, hang on, what might be possible? So in their case, they wanted to help their youngest son with a deposit for a home for $30,000. Did that work? Yeah, we put it into the modeling. Brian had always wanted a Mustang. So I worked out how much it would cost. Well, he told me. Susie agreed, and it worked. So we got a Mustang as well. Susie had a dream as well. She wanted to take her sons and their families on an all expenses paid holiday. Thank you, mums. Let's have a round of applause for the mums. Brian got the car. Susie wants to take the family on holiday. You know, I tell you what, I think Mother's Day every day. Yeah, well, that worked as well. Some dreams weren't possible. So once they dared to dream, that they had all these things. They wanted to purchase a motorhome. Okay, and they're in excess of 150K. That wasn't possible. Because bear in mind, they've only got a certain amount of retirement nest egg, and not everything is possible. But I did say they could purchase a camper trailer. Okay, so the modeling is complex. The purpose of this slide is not to go through every detail because we'll be here for another hour. It's to show you that the level of detail is there to tell you exactly how much you've got at each life stage, when Centrelink will kick in, and that you have enough for passive and fail by going hard in the active phase. And so they were able to have peace of mind. If that's something you'd like help with, there is an exit survey at the end. So whether it's the preliminary service where you'd like to move to optimal or get some retirement modeling, you can just tick yes, and the best time to call you tomorrow, and I will give you a buzz. So we're coming to the end of the webinar. I've got a lot of questions and I'll aim to do them, but I always find it's easy to listen to someone's story. So I've got a QR code. I mean, I've got to say COVID was good for one thing, and that's QR codes. So if you want to find out Mike and Jane's story, and thank you, Mike and Jane. We've got quite a number of people, so I don't know whether you're still on, but I hope you're doing well. And that's the motorhome that Mike and Jane purchased. Mike had a dream to buy one. I'm waiting for him to come by Sydney and give me a tour inside. That's Brent. His dream was to buy a Porsche, and his wife has got another fancy car as well, but nothing wrong with toys if we can afford it. Tony and Gail had a dream of living for 6 months in Europe, and that's what they're doing at the moment. I follow their stories, but it's possible for us as property investors to live our best retirement, and often the cost of doing nothing is significant because we've only got so much time inactive. So if you look to do it next year, the year after, you've just utilized a couple of years off your active, and it's certainly a lot more than the cost of advice. I always say the cost of doing nothing is more than the cost of advice. Okay, so let's now move on to some questions. I hope that's been beneficial for you this evening. I'd like to start and finish on time. So I'll go through a couple of questions, and I've got another scenario. Or actually, I'll start from the top. Those ask questions first because I did want to get through the session first. So, so let's go to Charles. How long before retirement is a good time to start retirement planning? Well, I always say 10 years before. For full retirement planning, certainly no later than 55. And if you're younger than 55 or 50, it's good to make sure you're doing everything you can to get to the optimal stage. Because imagine if Brian or Susie had saved that 100K 10 years before, had a big impact on their overall wealth. Bishma said, what's the expected annual income is required to double an average for a couple? Not really sure what that means. What is the expected annual income? Maybe that's in terms of living expenses, and there was 2 handouts. Those handouts were available, and if not, just go to ASFA, living expenses, and you'll get that. Peter said the downloads work, so that's great. Tony said the club is aimed for members to live above the pension. Discussion just then was transition to retirement and a random fail. What has changed? I think that's a good question to ask your property mentor, Tony. My goal is to help people retirement, and the great thing about Kevin's plan is, particularly if accumulation, it gives us options. So it's enabled, well, all of my clients to be in a position where they can retire comfortably. And we've got Phil, if you're dependent on your rent for cash flow, how do you balance the amount of liquid assets needed to cover for non-planned expenses? Going more liquid will reduce rents coming and eat into liquid assets. You're right. You're absolutely right. And it's a balancing act. That's why the modelling is so important, to make sure you've got enough liquidity. It's not straightforward, Phil. And the reason I have peace of mind when I complete a process of retirement planning is to look at that retirement model. Now, if I look at a downside with the retirement model that we do, it's a snapshot. It's a snapshot in time today. Things could change tomorrow. Things will change next week. Things will be very different in another year. So it is a snapshot in time. Moving on, Suzanne said, I've got 6 properties plus a home, looking to downsize. Can't go borrow money. There's a lot of detail here, Suzanne. I don't think I can cover the scenario. I will cover the point about Centrelink. I don't feel I have enough to live on for the next 30 years, like benefits Centrelink. Well, it comes, why do you feel you don't have enough for 30 years? You've got 6 rentals plus a home. It's a case of just looking at the options to restructure your portfolio to boost the income. Many of my clients, not many, a good portion of them were already retired, came to me, and I was able to boost their income. Mike and Jane, a classic example. I know Jill and Bev in Clifford in South Australia, exactly the same scenario. Okay, best ways to use our properties and super for better growth. Too much of a general question there. I'll have to look at that. I'll have to move on because it's too general and it's too broad. Charles said, my investment loans are reverting to P&I at the end of April. I've been told by my bank, can't get an interest only extension. Well, it's a case of the bank may not be able to assist you. That's why we've got club loans mortgage brokers. Certainly, there's more options than one through your bank. Laurel says, what happens in retirement when the loans revert to P&I? Well, they increase, the loan repayments increase. The question is, what's the impact of that on your portfolio? Sean, 64, went to see a financial planner associated with my industry fund who had no idea but to sell the portfolio. What's your fees for retirement planning? I've covered that, Sean, in terms of the fees. It's a case of when you engage a planner, or engage any professional, ask them about their expertise, and particularly their association with an organisation like the Property Club. Kathy said, how can I determine when to help the kids into property and how much I can give them? Well, I think in retirement, the biggest mistake people make is give money to their kids too early, inactive. I think it's important to make sure you have enough being reactive, and then when you move to passive, determine if that's enough. Anything over and above, you can start thinking about giving to the kids. But it's important to only consider that when you've gone to the end of your active period. How does the retirement plan account for the cost of nursing care in frail? I did cover that already as well. Last couple of, there's a lot of questions. I'll only cover 2 more. If I sell a property at age 45 and put the surplus funds into the share market, will they produce different results? Look, I'm pro share market, but I'm also pro property. I've got both asset types. The advantage of having property is the leverage though, Dan. So I'm not to say share market will give you better results than property, but I think the leverage associated with property gives you better overall absolute returns. And I believe in diversification as well. Jack said, how were they able to extend interest only for 5 years at 62? Jack, I think you need to speak to your mortgage broker, who I know personally, and he'll be able to tell you. Matt says, the final question, can you leverage into the share market in the SMSF? You can, but the cost of financing is a lot higher than leveraging into property. So that's why with my portfolio, this is my personal preference. I've got 5 IPs outside, I've got 1 IP inside. So yeah. Okay, there will be an exit survey at the end. So I hope that's been beneficial. And as you know, the discussion today was principle based. So I hope those questions were helpful for you to think and talk about and discuss with your advisor. But it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you, and I hope you have your best retirement ahead of you. Good evening, and thank you once again.
How you going? How was the TV?